So, time to continue. So we have Johan Vikström from IFAU presenting his paper on active labor market policies. Please.
Thanks a lot. So earlier today we have had two super interesting presentations. One on a super novel hiring experiment from Finland and this super nice meta-analysis from Denmark. These two presentations were quite focused on one specific RCT. In my paper, in my talk, I'm going to do this a bit differently. I'm going to take a more broader perspective on active labor market policies. And the kind of starting point for this article was, of course, the question from Rope and Antti. Do you want to write something about this? And of course, the first thing you're thinking about, do I really have something to say about this topic? And then I thought, okay, I've been doing RCTs for 10 years in Sweden. Probably I have a lot of things to say. And I started to think about things. What do I want to discuss? Yeah, I want to discuss things about ethics, about cost, implementation issues, policy recommendations, all these kind of more practical things that you don't really put into your research papers. Because in the research paper, you have like a really, really tight section about the experiment, but usually not so much about all these other things. So that was kind of the starting point for me. And I'm also going to take a more broader perspective across the Nordic countries, not only Sweden. And okay, and I'm going to talk about, of course, experiments. And I'm going to use this concept RCT. That's all over my slide. That is a randomized control trial. So when you see RCT, think about an experiment, for those of you who are not familiar with the concept. And when you start to think about like RCTs on active labor market policies around the Nordic countries, you realize that there actually have been quite a lot of them on a various number of topics. You can always debate what is labor market policies, but if you're liberal in that definition, you can include all these things. It's things like private providers, online recommendations, meeting, activation programs, information, and so forth. And if you think about the distribution across time and countries, you see that this experiment has been going on for quite some time. And here I just mentioned two of these two really early experiments, both from Sweden in 2004 and this super famous Danish experiment in 2005-06, where they looked at specific questions. Here I've also then added other examples, and here I know that I'm going to offend people in the room and in the audience, because this is not an exhaustive list of everything. I think I'm way more accurate on the Swedish RCTs. So please email me afterwards about things that I have not on the list. But as you can see, there has been quite a lot of experiments in the last years. Quite a lot from Sweden, some from Denmark, but there are also examples from Norway and Finland. You can, of course, discuss what is active labor market policies, but I think your study is labor market policy. Yes. And there's also this earlier Finnish, smaller job search course in an earlier RCT from Finland. So there are examples from all the Nordic countries. And if you have seen the list of the topics covered, you can immediately you can say that, okay, this is like super policy relevant, but just to hammer it down about why this is important, I just want to say a few words. Okay, so of course these policies are about getting unemployed people back to work. And that is of course super important for the individual, both being unemployed have social and economic consequences, but also for society, of course, because we have people, we have to pay unemployment insurance benefits and other related benefits. So getting people quickly back to work is like a super important policy, which is kind of already highlighted through the different topics covered in the RCTs. Okay, so what I'm going to do specifically in this paper, I've already said I provide some example of RCTs, And then in the end, I decided to pick 3 specific RCTs. And I'm not going into detail into them. I'm just giving like an overview. So it's an experiment on private providers in Denmark, early meetings with the caseworker from Sweden, that's my own study, and a light touch habit intervention from Norway. And then I'm going to use these kind of experiment as a foundation to discuss various aspects of conducting labor market RCTs. Things like I've already said, like how do you motivate these experiments, ethical considerations, implementation issues, and also some topics that I've found particularly important when evaluating these RCTs. So what I'm going to do now with my time is I'm going to start to present these 3 RCTs. And the presentation will be, in the interest of time, pretty brief, but we can discuss details later on. Okay, okay, I had this slide as well. Okay, so of course, if you see the long list of different RCTs, the message is of course not that we are done. The message is instead that there is a lot of more evidence needed, I think. And there's many different reasons for that. Okay, there are new policies introduced everywhere in the Nordic countries. We need to know how they work. Policies also change over time, and exactly how the policy is designed can matter really a lot for how they work. For example, looking at Elias' presentation. And also, if you have evidence from Sweden, it may not be strictly true that you can generalize those results to other countries. And we also need information on what type of programs works best for different groups. And to kind of have to get information on all these things, conduct an experiment is the best way, I think. Okay. Now going to the examples. So the first study is a study by Revald et al. From 2017. And it's an experiment on private providers in Denmark. And what do we mean by private providers? So if you go back in time, traditionally, most of the labor market services, at least in Sweden and in other Nordic countries, have been given in-house by public employment services. For example, in Sweden, we have Arbetsförmedlingen. They had their own offices, their own caseworkers. They designed and provided all the services to the job seekers. But recently, specifically in Sweden and also in other countries, it has become more popular to contract out these kind of services. So instead of doing it yourself, you hire a private firm to do it for you. Okay? And if you think about theoretically, there could be pros and cons here with doing so. One is, of course, is that if you have a private firm that have economic incentives to provide these services in a good way, that may spur innovation, new methods, doing it in a more providing the services in a more cost-efficient way. So theoretically, there are reasons to think that this is a good idea, but there are also theoretical reasons to think that this is not such a good idea. Because one thing that could happen is that you cannot specify everything in the contract with a private provider, and then they have incentives to cut costs by reducing the quality of the services, because you cannot really monitor them fully. So it's an open question in what direction the results will go. And the RCT from Denmark, this is like a really standard experiment. You randomize between 2 different options. You have a specific target group. In this experiment, the target group was newly registered unemployed university graduates. A fairly large sample. The interesting thing here is that in this case, the private providers are the baseline treatment. So the control group, they get the private providers, because that was the kind of default option in Denmark at the time. And then they decided, okay, now we want to see does this work or not, so they randomized some people to instead go to the municipal job center. Okay, so you have this this control group and treatment group. And when you're thinking about private providers, we know from research, also recent research from Finland, that exactly how you design these systems may matter a lot. We can talk forever about that, but here I'm going to be super brief and just mention that in this case, they selected 17 providers for a tendering round, and then they allocated the job seekers to these different providers, which were paid a compensation that was heavily based on their performance. So if they were successful to get people back to work, they got paid more. Yeah, so that's the basic setup. Randomizing between private and public.
One question, does the public also get bonus then if they are successful?
No. Okay, some key results from this study. So when comparing, so there was no difference in terms of employment outcomes between the private and the public providers. But the private providers turned out to be more expensive, okay? Around something like 20 to 25% more expensive. So in this case, the conclusion is that private providers are less cost effective. Okay. They're also, if you look at other Nordic RCTs, we can discuss the recent Finnish one later on, but if you look at other RCTs around the Nordic countries, for example, we have this Egebark et al. Study from 2024, which I was involved in, where we did a similar thing, plus some extra things. We also reached similar conclusions, that private providers, no more employment, costs more. So in terms of policy, the conclusions from these RTs seem to be that private providers do not work as intended. Okay. The other example is early meetings in Sweden. And this is a study that I've been involved in. And here the idea is to look at these kind of traditional parts of labor market, active labor market policies. You mean we think about you're unemployed, you go to the office, you meet with the caseworker, you discuss, make a plan. How does this work? So here we kind of randomly said that, okay, early on, in the 3 first months of unemployment, you get 3 additional these meetings. Basically, it went from 1 to 4 meetings. How does this work? But here we also had a more ambitious aim, thinking about things like that. We talk about kind of general equilibrium effects. So basically, the idea being that, okay, if you give these early extra meetings to some people, and they get the job, okay, this is not happening in a vacuum, right? It could displace jobs for other job seekers. And that is, of course, super important to take into account, because the direct effects could be good, but if it's only about displacing jobs for others, it's not worth doing it. So in this case, where I kind of tried to push in my article also that, okay, standard RCT, treated and non-treated, but you can basically design way more elaborate randomized designs, okay? And in this case, we had a 2-level randomization inspired by a study from France. So basically, we randomized across both offices and job seekers. So we started from 72 offices. Half, we said, provide early meetings, but only to randomized set of job seekers. So basically, we had these 3 groups: treated job seekers at treated offices, non-treated job seekers at treated offices, and non-treated job seekers at non-treated offices. And basically, if you want to know what is the direct effect of this policy, you compare 1 and 2. Okay, they are in the same environment. One get the treatment, one do not get the treatment. If you want to think about job displacement, essentially you compare 2 and 3. 2 is an environment where they face increased competition, 3 is not. But neither of them actually do get the treatment. So that was the whole idea in that paper. And in terms of results, it seems that, or these early meetings, they do work, but they also create a lot of job displacement. Okay? So if you get these early meetings, people get back to work earlier. And one reason for that was that they got these kind of vacancy referrals. So they got information and proposals about suitable jobs to apply to. But it also created a lot of these kind of displacements that I've already talked about. But if you look at the kind of the overall effect, we see that the net effect is positive. So it's not all about displacement. And we also had something about kind of face-to-face meetings and distance meetings. Okay, so that was the second study. The third study that I use in my article is this habit intervention by Vatt et al. You can correct me later for the pronunciation. And the kind of the starting point here is that what I think is a bit fascinating going forward in terms of labor market policies about all these kind of behavioral aspects of searching for a job. So, I mean, if you think traditionally, when you're focusing on unemployed people, we need to train them, we need subsidies, we need all this kind of hardcore stuff. But in this paper, they focus on the fact that being unemployed is like from a psychology perspective, really tough, right? You are in a difficult situation. You lose your daily routines. You may lose your social contacts from your workplace. So you're in some sense, a big trouble. And the idea was here that, okay, can we try to do something quite simple to try to help the unemployed job seekers? So what they designed was online intervention designed to kind of mitigate kind of harmful habits like not sleeping enough, not exercising enough, or substance use. So they collaborated with NAV in Norway, and they started with a quite big group of youths, and they sent out an online survey about these kind of habits. And for the people who completed the full survey, they randomized. Some people got an additional intervention, some did not. And those that got the additional intervention, they got these kind of basic 3 steps. So first you had the questions about your current habits. Then the participants were asked to reflect on these habits and express goals for the future. And at the end, they got like a summary of their answers. Basically, here is your reflection, here's your goal. Now go out and try to do something about this. So that was basically the intervention. Does this work or not? Does it work? Yes. Matti is a clever guy. I'm too predictable, sorry. Yes. So fascinatingly, this low-cost goal-setting invention led to improved labor market outcomes. You can always discuss effect sizes, but given that the cost is like nothing, it's done online, any effects is good. But here it turned out to be actually surprisingly large positive effects. And also when they did follow-up surveys asking about habits, they saw that the habits actually did improve. Okay? And I think that this study is interesting because it kind of adds to these more light touch interventions. Here I've taken only 2 examples. I know that I probably should have Sophie's paper here as well, but yeah, that's how it is. So one example is a colleague from Uppsala, Lena Hensvig, with French co-authors. She have designed this like online job recommendation tool, but they also have a randomized study. This study by Cox et al. Is a study that I'm involved in, where we sent out motivational emails to job seekers, trying to motivate them. This is not yet the working paper, but I can say that this intervention did not produce the intended results, which is interesting, but that's a topic for another day. Okay, so this was kind of 3 examples of like RCTs, experiments on labor market policies. And then of course you can always reflect on why do you want to do this. And I think this is a bit of a difficult discussion, because if you're talking about to academics, they are all believers. They all believe in experiments. It's the gold standard. So if you're an academic, you can stop listening during this slide. If you're a non-academic, I think there's a lot of mixed views on experiments. But here I'm going to really for those that are not yet convinced, I will try to convince you why this is like a super good idea. So if you think about the traditional evaluation of labor market policies, you have some people who got the treatment, they may be training, and some people who did not get the treatment. Okay? You may try to compare these groups, perhaps adjusting for some observed characteristics. But okay, what do you in the end get out of that comparison? And I think that comparison can be extremely difficult for several reasons. Because if you are not in a controlled environment doing or flipping the coin in experiments, there's a lot of things that affect whether a certain individual become treated or not. I mean, some individuals are super motivated, so they go get the training. Some caseworkers like that person, they put that into training, but not the other person. So there's a lot of these kind of selection problems that can really destroy a non-experimental study. Of course, there's a lot of quasi-experimental studies out there that solve this problem in other ways. But fundamentally, without a RCT, we may be in a big problem. Basically, it may be the case that we only capture selection problems and not causal effects. And of course, the RCT offers like a super, not a simple, but at least a solution to this problem. Basically, by flipping the coin, we can make sure that the treated and the controls are comparable. And to give a concrete example, return to the study about the private providers. Okay? So if you're not in a RCT world and you want to evaluate private providers, okay, you may have a situation where some people choose to go to a private provider and some people choose not to do so. But who are the people choosing to go to a private provider? They are a selected subset of people. And in particular, an early study from Uppsala by Benmark et al., they show that they had an RCT and they showed that there were no positive employment effects of private providers from the RCT. But using the same data, they basically discarded the RCT variation and only used the traditional selective variation in a non-RCT setting. And they show that if you do that, it seems like private providers are hugely beneficial. Okay? So that means if you do the traditional non-experimental thing, you would say private providers are great, continue to spend a lot of money on it, versus in the RCT, that was not the case. So the importance for policy cannot be underestimated. Okay, that was my preaching. I'm going to preach some more on other topics, but bear with me. Okay, ethics is important, but I don't think that it should stop us. In particular, if you think about labor market policies, and you think in a world where kind of public agencies are thinking about labor market policies, what are they doing? They have to make these decisions. Who should we give this training to? or should we not get the training to? And rarely do they have perfect information about who is best suitable for the training programs. So they have a lot of like complexity in their decisions. And they also typically operate under binding constraints. So they cannot give everyone the treatment. So they have to select some, but they don't have the information to do that perfectly. And you can always say that, okay, but by now we know a lot about labor market policies, what works and what do not work. But we don't know the effects about all different types of policies. So at the end of the day, in a non-experimental setting, you have to allocate resources, rare resources, to an intervention for which you do not know the effect, and you have to do complex decisions about deciding who gets the treatment and who do not. And if you're in such a setting, I don't think it's, from an ethic standpoint, problematic to instead do the experiment. Okay? Because essentially, you have all these complex things, and then you can do the experiment. Essentially, that's my view on it. Because the gains from doing so is that you actually learn about whether this policy works or not. And you could even, if I'm going to preach even more, you can even argue that it's kind of unethical to assign people to things for which you do have no clue about whether they work or not. Okay, so that's the preaching. But I also want to point out that you have to be careful with thinking about ethics, because it's not always that these things are there. It could be the case there where you have an intervention where you strongly believe that this is a good thing, and you have money to treat everyone. Then I think it would be super problematic to randomize some people out of that possibly very beneficial treatment. So it's a complex decision, but rarely in my experience it has not been the case that ethics have stopped us from doing stuff. But there have been such cases. Okay, implementation is painful. And yeah, you have already, previous presentations have been a bit touching about on this, especially Elias, that if you want to do an RCT, yeah, it's painful, really painful. And you should keep that in mind. But if we want to have this credible evidence, I think we should do it anyways. But we should keep in mind that there are a lot of things that could go wrong. So I think that having basically what I have on my last bullet point there, good implementation requires good collaboration between public agencies and academic researchers. So kind of academic researchers, we can design the experiments, evaluate them, help to motivate them, but you also really need these kind of public agencies, people within the public agencies that are willing to do it properly. And I would also like to preach about this kind of implementation reports. So we have conducted in Sweden several RCTs, and only once did we write an implementation report. That is that we, in addition to our big scientific paper, we also wrote a more elaborate version about all the implementation issues that we encountered during the experiment. Writing such a report is of course also painful, but I think it's beneficial. And we should have done that way more often in Sweden, I think. And here I'm not going to discuss all these things that you may encounter, but in that implementation report and also in my article, I briefly mention things that could go wrong, right? For example, how do you motivate local employment offices to participate? How do you motivate caseworkers to really follow the treatment protocol, and so forth? All these things that you have to be aware of when conducting these RCTs. Okay. I think I'm going to go here. Okay. So another thing is, I think that is when you're looking at RCTs on labor market policies, you typically, of course, have some effect estimates for things like time in unemployment, employment probability, it could be wages, and so forth. So typically you measure the employment effects in a very, very good way. But of course, this is only one side of the coin. Of course, costs are also important. For example, if you have a study with a small positive effect, I mean, if the intervention is costly or not may lead to very different conclusions. So for example, if you have an online intervention where the costs are basically zero, even a small positive effect is enough. But if you have like a really super expensive training program that have a small positive effect, it may not be worth it. So looking into the cost side is super important. And to do so, to even push that argument even further, I just put up these two studies by Revald and Egebark et al., where I already talked about the private providers, because both these studies find neither positive or negative effects or employment effects of private providers. So if these studies would not have studied costs, what did we learn? Is this positive or negative? It's zero. It all depends, is the private provider cheaper or more expensive? So for both these studies, I think that the cost analysis was super crucial. But of course, there's always challenges. And I think that cost analysis, there's a lot of challenges here. Because we need to, of course, measure all these things in a sensible way. And typically with our Nordic register data, we typically have information on employment, like how much you earned and these kind of things. But the cost side can be way more trickier. And it's, on top of that, there's also a question about what is it actually that you want to do in your cost analysis, right? Because if you are more like attacking this from an academic point of view, we know that we should think about a cost-benefit analysis, like a strict cost-benefit analysis, where we really should compare all relevant costs, the things that consume resources. And we should compare that with benefits that kind of create new resources, in a sense. But this becomes a bit tricky. So think about private providers, okay? We pay the public agencies, they pay the private providers to do things. If they use that to hire caseworkers, it consumes resources. It's a cost. If they take all the money for profits, it's redistribution, not a strict cost. So thinking about these things, it becomes super tricky to do like a really proper cost-benefit analysis. And therefore, it's often easier and more commonly done to do what is called like a more of a public spending analysis. But that is kind of like second order kind of what you want to do in a strict sense. But I think it's still very interesting to do. And then you have to carefully think about what are the costs. Yeah, that's the cost in terms of public spending on the intervention, things like caseworkers' time, money to private providers, office spaces, all this kind of stuff that you're kind of spending your money on to do in the intervention. Basically, how much does the government spend? And benefits could be saved public cost and increased revenues. So for example, lower payments on unemployment insurance benefits or higher taxes. So, and then it becomes more like of a, you see the point, a public spending calculation. How much does the public spend and how much do they gain? But it's not a strict cost-benefit analysis. But I would also underscore that the importance of thinking about how to measure costs already from the beginning, because working in the Swedish context, I mean, for example, with the case where we had the early meetings, the 3 extra early meetings with the caseworker. Yeah, okay. Caseworker salary, that is just a big part of the local budget. How could we separate the cost for our specific intervention from all other costs at the local employment offices? So it was not an easy thing to do, so we had to try to use surveys asking caseworkers exactly how much time did you spend on this, use that to calculate the total time they spent on intervention, use the wages to calculate the costs in a kind of backward inducing way. But the message is that do not forget about costs, but try to plan for that already in the beginning. And my lesson is that employment effects is typically easier to measure than the cost side. Okay. What should I talk about more? I have 9 minutes. Sorry? Yeah. So I also mentioned this, what I called in my article obvious things, but I want to at least say something about them. One is that the thing that we encountered in Sweden is this with the objective outcomes. So if you want to measure employment effects, you have to be aware that sometimes the measurements that you have for unemployment and employment can be manipulated. For example, in Sweden, you have the unemployed public employment office, Arbetsförmedlingen, have their records where they kind of have records of time in unemployment. But those records are contingent upon both caseworkers and job seekers accurately reporting back to the public employment office when they actually found a job. And this kind of data can be manipulated. For example, if you have a system with private providers and they are based on results, then they are of course super keen on making sure that their job seekers immediately when they find a job tell the public employment office, hey, I got the job, private provider get their bonus. So there are things in some type of registers that can be manipulated, while others cannot be manipulated in the same sense. For example, in our study on private providers, we used tax records. So basically information from tax records about exactly how much people earned and did not earn, which is more reliable than these different types of things that could be manipulated. And that turned out to make a big difference. Yeah, also do a pre-analysis plan. Another thing is that, we were discussing earlier also this about take-up, and I basically put up this thing in my article because it has been a kind of a public debate about take-up in Sweden. So I thought, okay, I have to write something about that because that has been something that is bugging me. So of course, if you do an RCT and you say that these people should go to a private provider and these people should not go to a private provider, that's the kind of optimal setting. But then of course, caseworkers and other people actually have to make sure that these people actually go to a private provider. And that rarely or never happens to the complete. So there's never ever 100% take up. Okay, there's some cases, but rarely it's 100%. Because there are things that people that you lose on the way. But this does not mean that, this usually does not mean that everything is destroyed. The important thing is that there is like a significant difference between the two groups in how many actually do get the treatment. Okay? And you can still measure this intention to treat effect that have been described this morning. So You will never get 100% take up. That does not mean that everything is lost. The key thing is that you have significantly large difference and a large enough sample to detect effects. So the last thing, I've already talked about this, and I think that this is important going forward, because essentially, traditionally you think about an RCT, you have a treatment group and a control group, and that's it. But you can think about different kinds of randomization designs. This two-level randomization design was one example. You can have two-level randomization designs in different ways, randomized between more than one and between two options. You may have some kind of sequential randomization. You may combine machine learning and randomization in adaptive experiments. So going forward, I think that this is a super important road going forward. Essentially only our creativity can stop us from learning more. The last thing I want to say is that we have great data in the Nordic countries. So even if you're doing an RCT, make sure to use the Nordic data, because there's a lot of information typically in these registers that you can use to learn more about underlying mechanisms and so forth that may help you get a better study, more easier to translate to other settings and so forth. And also what I talked about, general equilibrium effects. So remember the early meetings, there could be displacement of jobs. So if you have an intervention, it may have really good direct effects, but it may also have side effects on wage bargaining, job displacement, vacancy creation, and so forth. And learning about these general equilibrium effects, there are some studies on it, but not so much. I'm going to finish ahead of time.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Johan. And next we have a comment from Jukka Mattila from the Ministry of Finance of Finland. Please.
Thank you. There are two green buttons.
The big one in
The big one. Yeah.
Big one in the middle. Great. It's a trick question, you know. So for those who don't know me, I'm Jukka Mattila from the Ministry of Finance in Finland, and I have been, in this sense, in a privileged position because I've been able to work with different stakeholders. I work with a lot of you Finnish researchers here. I have worked with municipalities, I have worked with the public employment services, I have worked with the health service providers, I have even worked with the politicians. So my pragmatist view in the discussion we're having is not so much about whether it's good to have randomized controlled trials or not. I think I would be preaching to the choir on this subject, but I would like to go a little into what Han already touched in his remark previously, and he mentioned that it shouldn't be up to personal relationships with the bureaucrats and the researchers, which either kindle or extinguish the idea of randomized controlled trials. Because we do agree here that if we want cost-effective policies, we need probably randomized controlled trials. So I think the question I have been thinking, looking at this, has a lot to do with this basic economic question of incentives. So I will try to look at the incentives of different stakeholders and reserve the right to be a little provocative and possibly a little negative because I'm a Finnish person. I don't know how you people do this so well in Denmark. We always wonder how it happens because we have like such fundamental issues and you seem to be having a long list of trials and meta-analysis of those. Okay. So my first point has to do with the bureaucrats, those people working at the public employment services or the ministries themselves. And Johan brought up the idea that you could bypass the ethical question through reasoning and saying that, okay, so if you have constrained budget and you can only provide this and this training for those people, then perhaps randomizing might be equally a sensible or fair way of providing these services to people as allocating them by the caseworker. The obvious answer is going to be that the caseworker knows better. So why would you have to kind of figure out what is efficient if we already have strong evidence as experienced by the caseworker that the allocation is good? And then we're touching on the incentives, because the caseworker actually doesn't have very many incentives, or the supervisor of the caseworker, to ensure that the policy they are providing is efficient. In fact, they might have incentives to the contrary. First, it's not their budget, they get money from somewhere, from the wall of the Kela or the public finances or something, and then if you want them to participate in one of your freaky trials, they will have to adjust. They will have to do things different. They will have to partake in this troublesome idea that is randomizing people, which may seem like a little thing, but it breaks up their Monday morning routine, and they don't want that. And even worse, it might turn out that you end up proving that what they've been doing for 10 years has actually maybe not been helpful, but actively harmful. So which one of you wants to be the bureaucrat finding out that what they've been working on for 5 years is total waste of money? No, not gonna fly. Not here. So it's already being done well. Don't have to fix what's broken. So I think often you wind up with this ethical argument, but the ethical argument at its core is not an ethical argument. It's just reasoning given to you why they don't want to do it, and they don't want to tell you the actual reasons why they don't want to do it. We had this funny incident recently where a couple of municipalities wanted to relax some of the legislation that have to do with the public implement services. They were kind of medium-sized areas like Lahti, which is small on global scale, but medium-sized in Finnish scale. And we really tried to discuss with them over this subject that no, can't randomize. We have this consultant though, however, who has these synthetic control groups, and he's promised to estimate as welfare effects of this exam with the synthetic control group. So comparing a little bit of Lahti to a little bit of Jyväskylä and maybe a pinch of Stockholm too, who knows. So it's not always clear that even a technical explanation of why a controlled trial would be better will change their minds. I will not be overly negative, because I think, for example, in Helsinki, they are making big strides in the positive direction, and this might have to do with fixing the incentives. So the municipalities now have more financial responsibility over the unemployment. They also have more power over the practical organization. So at least something positive is happening, and we are hoping that it'll carry us in the future. But again, it's not a point of convincing the people in Helsinki that this is the way to go alone. It is also about making sure that the incentives are in place for them to have an actual clear incentive to make sure their policies are efficient. So the politicians. These people again. So accountability is not something politicians enjoy. So this is why on global scale we use legislation to enforce accountability on politicians. It's not in their DNA and not in their best interests. We've tried really hard on multiple occasions to maybe not have a randomized controlled trial because it's difficult, but at least have some natural experiment in implementation of these policies, because that would give us some leeway to look at those things. Guys, no. And why would you want to know how the effects go? Because fundamentally politics is about ideology. So if you've just passed a brilliant reform like a basic income, and then you've made the mistake of making it a randomized controlled trial, and then just before the next elections, some bloke from some research department digs his way out of the basement and comes and tells you, actually, this big idea you had, it had no effect at all. And then this was the spearhead of your ideology on labor market policies. So in this sense, I don't have an answer on how we fix the politicians. We probably can't fix the politicians, but again, rigorous ex post evaluation of these reforms where possible, even if it's not an RCD, is something we can work on with the accountability. Then the third culprit we have in Finland. This was a really curious point Johan made, which I think gives some thoughts on these kind of strange path dependencies which happen. So there was a remark on his article on something along the lines that maybe none of the Swedish randomized controlled trials would have turned out happening if there were no this bunch of really dedicated keen researchers in the Swedish public implement services inside the agencies lobbying for these randomized controlled trials and making them work. Now, this is an extremely positive case, but again, it comes down to what Hanna mentioned. It's about having this specific personal chemistry's work is not fundamentally about incentives. So what can also happen, which is not going to name institutions, which has happened in Finland, is that when we establish in one of these operational institutions an internal research department, then you have to remember that the quality and the kind of brand of the research department becomes a vested interest of the organization. So then when you have the data and you have the researchers in the same bucket, then there's a strong incentive to hoard the data and not give it out to anyone else, because they might be getting the privilege of researching those things you're supposed to be researching in your organization. So it's fundamentally, from the perspective of incentives, a flawed approach. Sure, you get lucky if you have the right kind of researchers from your perspective there, but then if you have the wrong kind of researchers, you might have some experience on this, then they will simply prevent you from doing any randomized controlled trials in the future, and not only prevent you from doing those randomized controlled trials by actively lobbying against them, they will also prevent other researchers from accessing the research data. So it becomes this massive lock-in effect. And again, it has to do with fundamental incentives. If you are an institution which both collects, stores the data and does the research on it, then you have a very strong incentive to allow kind of first-hand privilege the data for your own people, and then the external people come after if so. We've made some progress here, but still there was this funny example in one seminar I used, because in order to access data of a said institution, there was this discussion going on, but you have to have a co-author from that institution in order to do so. I don't know how it works with the statistics institution in Norway, but it's possible other people are experiencing similar problems as we are. Okay. Then a digression to the actual economics of the situation. The sad thing is that culture doesn't matter, and often when we are discussing labor market policy, the experience may not translate very well. So in Finland, we have this idea of improving the early activation, a lot in the same sense that we have in the Nordics. We have really strong idea of this kind of a high welfare network coupled with monitoring and activation. And then in 2017, we added like an obligatory job talk every 3 months with the public employment services. And as Johan mentioned, those records can be manipulated. There were dead people in the records, long dead, because the public employment services had made the allocation of resources efficiently so that if it's dead, don't have to interview it. But in serious sense, there was a natural experiment related to this one which proved that by removing the ability of the public employment services to decide whether they have to or do not have to interview people every 3 months, the employment results were improved. Okay, so in the ministry, taken by this evidence and the Nordic evidence, we wanted more of these early interventions, and we put 70 million euros there and successfully added it to the law. I don't think anyone knows where the 70 million euros went. We are not able to trace how much interviews we've been doing in an actual thorough level, but it's been a disappointment. And since the power to do these things was moved to the municipalities. They've now been actively lobbying to gain more flexibility in this process and not have to interview people every now and then, but be able to allocate the resources again as they seem fit. Some of them might use this to do randomized control trials. Some of them might do this to allocate resources. Who knows how? But fundamentally, I think the mistake we might have made here was to think that it would be so simple as to kind of mandate these things. It turns out that the caseworker can be different in Finland and the caseworker can be different in Sweden and Denmark. I don't know how they are where you live, but in Finland there's a lot of issues that have to do with kind of pushing people to look for jobs. Because pushing people to look for jobs causes ethical stress to the caseworker. So they would much rather be giving people a service that those people like instead of pushing them to get jobs. And whether this is like a phenomenon that is shared culturally or if it's just a Finnish thing, I have no idea. So to wrap up, I think randomized controlled trials can be the gold standard evidence. I'm not gonna go through a list of the actual technical practical issues here. But I will tell you that from the ministry's perspective, I think the core problem is in motivating the trials. So not randomized controlled trials as a single instrument, but the general idea of having public institutions be more cost efficient in their function. And of course, we all know by definition, public services are not meant to be cost efficient. It's not what they do well. So it's been really difficult. And I think fundamentally the problem is that the inbuilt incentives are really a problem that is slowing down progress. We are hoping that the kind of, by budging the fiscal responsibilities to the party responsible of the operative functions, this might be solved. I think this is kind of how Denmark works, but I'm not sure if it's actually a key component in their success or as we perceive it. Now, because this is an economic seminar, I will touch a little bit on the evidence. Also, there was a remark that if offices lack motivation to participate in an experiment, you should just pick those with motivation. But this is, again, this kind of thing of external validity that sometimes it might be that those offices who are motivated for the randomized control trial might be motivated for some reasons. For example, I'm not saying that an economics researcher is motivated to do a randomized control trial because randomized control trials produce the best evidence which lets you in the best peer-reviewed journals. But some bureaucrats might think so, that if you're in a progressive experiment, then things go well. It's called the Marshall effect or something like that. So in terms of a full layout of a randomized control trial, it isn't clear that the external validity is completely there. You might list reasons why someone might be very interested in participating in a trial, but not really in a full layout. In this sense, sometimes natural experiments do have their positive sides because then you'll just kind of lay it out on the entire terrain and use some other variation, which might be difficult, but in the end, I guess it's a question of technicalities. I hope in the future in Finland we can find ways of building our system so that the institutions themselves have stronger incentives. It's not only because it's what works, but it's only because of things like the very interesting Norwegian light touch intervention with these habit creation things. The thing is, on operative level, there would be so much potential, especially with these kind of digital light interventions. There's no way we can pass them down from the legal side down. It's not going to happen. We can't write a law for everyone to have this kind of a light touch habit creation function. It's something that has to happen on the operative side. So we have to be careful to build the incentives of the operative side so that they actually are going to be doing these things. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Jukka. And the next commentator will be Kari Hämäläinen from Vatt Institute of Economic Research. Please.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kari Hämäläinen from Vatt Institute of Economic Research, and I'm a believer. Which makes it very difficult to comment this paper. I mean, how to take 15 minutes to say that, all right, I'm basically agree with everything you said, but I'll try to do my best. And by the way, I'm also one of those researchers who crawled up from the basement to say that basic income is not probably the best idea you have. Anyway, outline of my speech is that I'll first give my general impression, then I'll talk about a couple of possible additions, and then talk about a couple of selected core lessons that we learned from this paper, and then I'll give my final thoughts. And I'll start by direct citation from the paper. Designing effective labor market policies requires reliable evidence on what works, for whom, and under what conditions. And we all want to know that. And it says that how important this topic really is. And as Johan said, convincing evidence is still limited. And we know that RCTs are the most effective method for addressing different kinds of selection problems. And Johan's paper shows that if there's will to truly know the effects, it can be done in the Nordic countries. And this paper also points out that, all right, there are a lot of difficult things to do when implementing RCTs. And most importantly, this paper also gives ways to handle those difficulties and how researchers have handled them. And of course, we have excellent register data which can be used together with RCTs to provide some convincing evidence. So, all in all, I really like this paper, and I hope that it will reach the reading lists of ministries' employment offices, and it's also useful for researchers interested in implementing RCTs, not only in labor market policy, but also in other aspects. Then let's go to the possible additions, and the first one is discussion on internal and external validity. We know that internal validity is high in RCTs if they are implemented properly, but the question is, can we really use those results outside the study groups? And this paper, as Johan mentioned, it's not a problem if there's a partial take-up, at least if there's enough difference between the treated and the controls. We have tools to handle it. But I think that voluntary participation and tendering may cause some problems. For instance, one of the examples of this paper is this light touch intervention, in which I haven't read it, sorry about that, but if I got it right, they sent a text message to target group members, which invited them to take part of this experiment. And randomization was then carried out across those who completed the online survey, and the results were really, really positive. I mean, 17 percentage points in employment rate. It's a huge effect. However, I'm not so sure that the effect will be the same among non-participants. If those are young people, young persons who are not interested in their living habits, then maybe setting them goals on how to sleep or not to use substances may have no effect whatsoever. And the same goes with tendering. I mean, if only those who benefit from the treatment decide to participate, then results may be different outside those who didn't participate. outside participants. So, if possible, participation in policy trials should be universal. I mean, after all, this is how legislation works. But if we don't know the effect beforehand, then it might be reasonable to try the policy change first among a smaller group of people, choose them non-voluntarily, and then after that we know what happens among them, then decide whether to implement the policy to everyone. And the other one, very minor one, is that power calculations could be mentioned explicitly in the text. I mean, it's implicitly covered as they are essential part of pre-analysis plan. But since there are those so essential components of RCT designs, that maybe it might be worth mentioning them explicitly. I mean, just to remind everyone that these are really important things to do when designing RCTs. Then, thoughts on a couple of core aspects in this paper. And the first is organization. And a very important insight in this paper is that in Sweden there's a dedicated implementation team responsible for delivering the intervention. And as we heard in Jukka's presentation, there have been dedicated researchers inside public employment services who have helped to carry out these RCTs. And they have also been co-authors in studies which has raised some criticism about the credibility of the results. But as Johan says in this paper, there are safeguards in place, such as pre-analysis plans. So I think that we can be assured that those results are objective. However, if one wants to avoid all criticism altogether, then one way to do it is to apply quality assurance process used in clinical trials. I mean, they have two groups. One group which provides overall supervision of the trial, and the other one which is the only body with access to unblinded data. And this data monitoring committee can make recommendations to the steering committee, which may, well, at its extreme, even terminate the trial if it turns out that these initial results are somehow harmful for the participants. And something along these lines could be useful in social sciences also. And the other one, well, there are plenty of lessons in this paper, and I just picked two of them. And the second one is ethical questions, which has been discussed already. And actually, this could be one of Johan's slides, I think. But I have two reasons to talk about ethical questions. First, well, I was a member in Finnish National Board on Research Integrity for 6 years, so I think that I know something about this issue. And the other one is a common initial reaction in the Finnish administration that randomization, well, is unethical. As Jukka said, it's some kind of self-help against doing anything special, but it's a common initial reaction. Luckily, despite this initial reaction, Finnish researchers have succeeded in using RCTs in studying social security, integration services, education, and so on and so on. But also not so much in labour market policy, though, which is really sad, as Johan said, that, well, participants need to be selected somehow. And we have studies which show that case workers do not necessarily do it as good as it could be done. And randomization is an alternative which would provide us information on what works and for whom. And Johan's paper makes it clear that these ethical concerns are, well, minimized or non-existing when there are new measures, excess demand, or plans to scale up or reduce the program. So there are plenty of opportunities to use RCTs in labour market policies, but not always. I mean, it's unethical if unemployed individuals were required to participate, and provided that they do not, they have sanctions. So this is unethical, of course, we can't do that, but not all participants are subject to such obligations. So, final thoughts. This is the citation I showed you in the first slide, and this paper demonstrates that reliable answers to these questions can be obtained through RCTs in Nordic countries. It also offers valuable guidance on designing and implementing RCTs in the context of active labour market policies. And, well, there are significant gaps in our knowledge, so hopefully future RCTs help us to address these questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Kari. We'll take one question or comment if there's one, and then we'll head out to lunch. Okay, maybe we'll take here. Okay. Question.
Very quick question to Kari. So, your latest point that it was unethical to have sort of compulsory participation in programs. Why so? I mean, a lot of programs have actually compulsory participation, also if it's not a research program. You can't face sanctions if you don't meet up to an active labour market program.
Yeah, I was referring to the Finnish system where they have implement plans, and in those plans there may be requirement to participate in some program. So in this case, I think it's unethical to not to randomize that kind of person out of the program if there's a sanction for this.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, so now it's time for lunch, and we'll be back here in 40 minutes. We can continue the discussion on this great paper during lunch. Okay, thanks.